10 years since the Lehman crisis then, Sir Howard, and we're still dealing with the aftermath, in a sense, in UK banking, because we still have large government ownership of some banks, including RBS. It's taken a long time to resolve. I read today there are headlines in the Times here in London talking about whether the bank, your bank, is going to pay a special dividend. RBS has said it will return money to shareholders pretty soon. So update us, given this report this morning, update us on the policy and where your thinking is. Yeah, well, we've got to a position where we've paid off our largest outstanding fine to the US Department of Justice, and we now have Tier 1 capital of over 16%, which is well above our target of somewhere between 13 and 14%. So the sequence is that there is a stress test, which the Bank of England is carrying out. Subject to the results of that stress test, if that reveals that we do still have surplus capital, then we need to think about how to return that capital to shareholders. What I said yesterday was that principally, we were thinking of a buyback. The government have got a big share sale. We do need a lower capital base now for the bank, which is a somewhat smaller bank than it was. And so a directed buyback seems to us likely to be the most logical route. I was asked yesterday if it could instead be a special dividend. Logically, the answer to that is it could be. But a directed buyback in the circumstances where the government still owns 62% and wishes to sell down seems to me to be the most likely route, and one which will benefit all shareholders, of course, because those shares would be bought back and simply retired, so each shareholder would own a slightly larger proportion of the bank. OK, so those are the possibilities you're dealing with, and a buyback possibly more likely. The article talking about £4 billion. We don't know the size of this yet, do we, until we get this analysis from the Bank of England? That's right. We don't really know the size until we've seen what the stress test tells us. It's a very extreme stress test this year. So that number is merely that if you subtract 13 or 14, say, from 16, you get 2% of core Tier 1, and that takes you to, somewhere around 4 billion. So that's just a mathematical. That wasn't a figure I produced, but if you want to produce that kind of number, then that's the territory we're in. Would you have thought some 10 years after the crisis that we'd still be at this point talking about how the government gets itself out of this shareholding of RBS? This has had a long shadow over UK banking in this particular area. No, I think people would not have expected it to take 10 years. My lecture yesterday, which was rather long perhaps, but it tried to explain why the bank is so much smaller, which has been attributable to the fact that it was the world's largest bank at the end of 2008 in terms of assets, and that was the worst time to be the world's largest bank. And so the scale of the losses on property lending, on Irish property, which were something like £12 billion. Also, the cost of all of the requirements imposed by the European Commission as a result of the bailout by the UK government have been much larger than were foreseen at the time. So all of those factors have gone to make the net asset value of RBS now sort of below £3 a share. We're trading roughly alongside Barclays and Standard Chartered in terms of our price to book, but it's hard to imagine that our price to book could get back to the level at which the government bought the shares.
So I had a delicate question, and if you want a tap dance around it, I understand. What is Anglo-American banking? I mean, on a day-to-day basis, when people talk wistfully about the continental banks becoming more Anglo-American, what does that really mean?
Well, it is the case that over the last 10 to 15 years, the big continental banks have concentrated a lot of their investment banking, well, all their wholesale banking, a lot of their fundraising in the London market. Now, I think we may be seeing a change of trend in that as a result of Brexit, but I guess that's what people mean. If you go and look at BNP Paribas or SocGen's trading operations in London, you are enormously impressed by their size and scale. So I guess that's what people mean by the way they've become kind of Anglo-American. But as I say, I think we may see rather a change in that over the next 5 years.